So if you look at the Horn of Africa, right there, with this incredible long Red Sea coastline, that's Eritrea.
Mm-hmm. A really volatile region.
Exactly. And its history is just, well, it's complicated, shaped by so many outside forces, constant struggles.
It really is a story of resilience, though. I mean, decades fighting for freedom, for their own identity.
Absolutely. And that's what we're getting into today, sort of the first part of that story. We're using Eritrea, a nation forged through struggle, part one,
Yeah.
by Bana Nagus as our guide.
Yeah, our mission here is to walk you through those key moments and maybe surprising facts from the source that really shaped Eritrea,
Yeah.
from way back in ancient times up to that crucial area right after World War II.
It's a period where its independence was, well, denied.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Where do we start?
Let's go way, way back. The source mentions these incredible archaeological finds. We're talking deep human history here.
Oh, yeah, the Danakil Depression. Specifically this site, Booyah. They found hominid remains there.
How old are we talking?
Like 1.5 to 2 million years old, roughly. It really puts Eritrea right there at the dawn of humanity. One of those places.
That's just astonishing to think about. And then later evidence, too, right? Around 5000 BCE.
Exactly. Prehistoric sites popping up. You find rock art, tools, even signs of early farming. People were definitely living there, adapting for millennia.
Building societies.
And moving into, let's say, recorded history.
Yeah.
The source brings up the scholarly idea about the land of Punt.
Ah, the place the ancient Egyptians traded with.
That's the one. The thinking is Eritrea is the most likely location. So you see, even way back then, it was important. Connected.
Strategically significant from the start.
Which probably explains why even before the colonial period we usually focus on, parts of Eritrea saw, invasion, occupations.
Like who?
The source mentions Egyptians, Ottoman Turks, mainly coastal areas like Massawa, the lowlands, and other regional powers would make incursions too.
But it wasn't easy for them, was it?
No, the material emphasizes that. Fierce resistance was common. It wasn't just a territory to be walked over.
That theme of resistance again.
Absolutely, it's a constant thread. But the next really defining period, the one that leaves a huge mark in this part of the story, that's the Italians arriving.
Right, late 19th century. They start with the coast, then push inland.
Yep. And their goal was clear: a settler colonial state.
And the source mentions the British kind of looked the other way, or even supported it
It
initially.
was tacit support, yeah. Seems it was tied up in their rivalry with France elsewhere. Geopolitics, as always.
Always playing a role. So Italy makes it official.
Declares Eritrea its Colonia Primogenita, its firstborn colony, January 1st, 1890.
Massawa was the capital first, then Asmara, which it still is today.
And that kicks off about 50 years of Italian rule. And the picture the source paints is, well, it's really complex. A paradox, almost.
Also, what was it like?
Well, on one hand, you've got brutal systemic exploitation. We're talking racial segregation, forced labor, land taken away, education severely limited, just enough to serve the Italians, basically.
Proper colonial apartheid policies. I read they even barred Eritreans from parts of their own capital, Asmara.
That's right. The oppression was real, widespread,
Yeah.
devastating for Eritreans.
But then there's the other side of the paradox.
Yeah, and here's where it gets really interesting. At the same time as all that oppression, there was this huge push for infrastructure development and modernization.
Driven by the Italians, for their own benefit, presumably.
Exactly. But the scale was massive. The source lists ports, railways, airports, hospitals, factories, communication networks.
Wow.
It actually positioned Eritrea as one of the most industrialized places in Africa at that time.
That just seems so contradictory. How do we make sense of that? Exploitation and development hand in hand.
Well, I think the insight is that colonialism itself is often contradictory, isn't it? They build for themselves, yes, but those structures, that infrastructure, it can outlast them. It creates a physical reality.
Something tangible.
And the ambition was incredible. Think about the Teleferica Massawa Asmara, a 75-kilometer aerial tramway.
75 kilometers.
Yeah, the world's longest cableway when they built it. Just imagine the scale of that project back then.
Incredible. And this infrastructure left a real legacy, didn't it?
Yeah.
The source mentions what the British found later.
It does. Quotes Rahel Almadam talking about the thriving local economy the British inherited. And a British officer, Brigadier Longrig, described it as highly developed.
Tier list.
Superb roads, a railway, airports, a European city as its capital, and public services up to European standards. High praise, considering the source.
And other visitors, too.
Yeah, Westerners in 1935 calling Asmara the most modern and progressive city in Italian East Africa. Massawa's harbor apparently the biggest between Alexandria and Cape Town.
So it wasn't just hype. It was real, modern development.
And not just in the main cities. The source points to Ticinay as an economic hub. Dickham Hare, nicknamed Zona Industria, like a second Milan, packed with factories.
It really paints a picture of significant economic activity, even if the methods were brutal.
Precisely. And here's the crucial point the source makes. This whole period, the shared suffering under Italian rule, the forced interaction, the new boundaries, it inadvertently forged the basis of an Eritrean state.
How so?
It created those modern borders, yes, but also a shared social history, a common experience that started to build a unique national identity across different communities. It shaped the very entity that would later demand independence.
Oh, which brings us to the next chapter, World War II and the British arriving.
Yep. The Battle of Keren, April 1941, British-led forces defeat the Italians, and Eritrea comes under British military administration, the BMA.
And this is where things take another turn. A betrayal, the source calls it.
A critical one. The material states the British made promises. Independence for Eritreans if they helped fight the Italians.
You use propaganda, right? Something about deserving a flag.
Yeah, powerful stuff. Eritreans, you deserve to have a flag. This is the honorable life for the Eritrean to have the guts to call his people a nation. Very evocative.
But hollow words in the end.
Completely abandoned once Italy was gone. Instead of independence, the source says the British started. Well, plundering.
Plundering. What do they take?
Industrial assets, infrastructure, selling off factories, railway parts, port equipment, just stripping assets for profit. Sylvia Pankhurst apparently called it a disgrace to British civilization.
So from Italian exploitation straight into British asset stripping.
That's the picture. And it wasn't just economic. The BMA actively tried to divide Eritrean communities.
Why would they do that?
The goal, according to the source, was to fragment the territory, make it look weak, disunited, incapable of being independent. The ultimate aim, partition it between Sudan and Ethiopia.
So they were actively working against the independence they'd hinted at.
Seems that way. The insight here is key. The British didn't necessarily see a weak territory. They saw the potential, the development inherited from Italy, and they wanted to control or dismantle that using division as their justification.
And Ethiopia was pushing a similar narrative, that Eritrea couldn't survive alone.
Absolutely. An Ethiopian official, Aklilu Haptewolde, told the UN in 1947 exactly that. Eritrea could not live by itself.
And the U.S., where did they stand?
The U.S. was getting drawn in, Cold War thinking starting to dominate. They seemed worried an independent Eritrea might fall into the Soviet orbit, so they were receptive to the Ethiopian narrative.
Okay, but what's fascinating is how the source challenges this whole idea of Eritrean weakness.
It does. It flips the script. It argues the real reason the British, Ethiopians, and Americans pushed this narrative wasn't because Eritrea was weak, but precisely because it wasn't. It had development potential. They wanted to control that asset.
So the public story was the opposite of the private motive.
That's the argument presented. Meanwhile, what did Eritreans themselves want?
Ah, the UN Commission. Sent in 1949 to figure things out. What do they find?
Crucially, the source highlights that the commission found the overwhelming majority of Eritreans they spoke to wanted independence. Full stop.
The will of the people was clear.
Documented, yes. And there was even a warning at the UN. The Pakistani delegate, Sir Zafrullah, basically said, deny self-determination here, and you're just sowing the seeds of future conflict.
A prophetic warning.
Tragically, yes. Because despite the commission's findings, what happened? UN Resolution 390, or see December Chat in 1950.
And that resolution?
It imposed a federation with Ethiopia. Against the majority will, Eritrea became an autonomous unit, supposedly, under the Ethiopian crown.
Imposed. And the source fingers the U.S. as the main driver.
Points clearly to U.S. sponsorship, yeah. Cold War strategic interests trumping Eritrean self-determination. Which really makes you ask, doesn't it?
What happens when global power plays just override what people on the ground actually want?
You get resolutions like 390V. And you get statements like the one from U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. It's infamous.
What did he say?
He acknowledged Eritrean opinions deserve consideration from the point of justice.
Sounds good, right?
Okay. But there's a but, a huge but, he continued. Nevertheless, the strategic interest of the United States in the Red Sea Basin and considerations of security and world peace make it necessary that the country be linked with our ally, Ethiopia.
Wow. Justice explicitly secondary to strategy. Laid out right there.
Stark, isn't it? And the result, unlike nearly all other former Italian colonies, Eritrea was denied independence after the war.
Denied its chance then.
And Emperor Haile Selassie in Ethiopia declared a national holiday, celebrated the restoration of Eritrea, and made sure to thank the U.S. for its help at the UN.
And the U.S. got its strategic prize.
The source details it clearly. Ethiopia granted the U.S. rights to set up military bases in Eritrea. The big one was Kagnu Station in Asmara, 1953. Became the world's largest overseas spy base at the time.
Kagnu Station.
Yeah.
And other deals followed.
Military aid, training for Ethiopian forces.
Eritrea's location and infrastructure were essentially traded for U.S. strategic positioning in the Cold War. So, the UN resolution talked about Eritrean autonomy, legislative, judicial powers. Did that actually happen?
Nominally, yes. But the source is emphatic. Ethiopia treated the whole federal arrangement with contempt from day one.
And started dismantling it.
Systematically, yes. Which, of course, paved the way for outright annexation later on, and that, inevitably,
Set the stage for war.
for long, devastating war for liberation.
So let's try to pull this together. What does this first part of the story show us? We've gone from ancient roots through foreign rule. It was oppressive, but also weirdly formative.
Yeah, forging that modern identity, those borders through shared experience, even shared suffering, and inheriting that infrastructure.
Then the betrayal by the British, the promises broken, and finally this forced union, driven purely by geopolitics, not by what Eritreans wanted.
Exactly. And understanding this history, it really shows you how powerful external forces can be, how strategic calculations made in Washington or London can completely alter a nation's path, overriding local desires.
And igniting decades of struggle. Because this wasn't a natural outcome, it was imposed.
It really makes you think that decision back in 1950, linking Eritrea with Ethiopia, justified by the U.S. for strategic interests and world peace.
Yeah?
Well, it ended up sowing the seeds for one of Africa's longest and bloodiest liberation wars. So the provocative thought maybe is, what does this history teach you about the real long-term cost of putting those strategic interests ahead of a people's right to decide their own future?